understanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Late Late Show with me, Seema Agarwal. I've been really looking forward to today's show, actually, because we're talking about a topic which is personally a passion of mine. I've actually built a whole business around it, and it's something that I'm always really curious to hear stories around. So today we're talking about voice and communication, and essentially how we say things. I always find that when conflicts and misunderstandings take place, people often say it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And how we say things with our students in particular is what I'd really like to talk about with my guest today, Silke Paulmann, Executive Dean at the University of Essex. Hi, Silke.
Hi, Seema.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm good. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like I haven't stopped since September. It's like you have this kind of whirlwind when you go back into teaching after summer, and I'm still waiting for it to calm down, but I can't see it happening anytime soon. So, yeah, how are things for you? Can you relate?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I teach less than I used to because of the administrative role that I have. But I think one thing I've noticed is that, well, there used to be ups and downs. I don't know if you have the same thing, but I always felt like the summer was quiet. And then, as you said, it kind of started again in September. But these days, it actually just feels as if we're powering through because we always have students. Either we have students who do summer work or we have students who start in January as opposed to October. There's always something going on. And while I relate to this feeling of, this can be quite exhausting, I think I kind of like the constant buzz on campus, which is, it's just nice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can relate to that part of, like going through the summer, because I teach a lot on the MAs, like with the MAs, and yeah, it's supervising for them, which continues over the summer. But I think it's like from my side, it's definitely less intense over the summer. I think probably September to about April is when it's the most hectic for me. I love the buzz actually as well. And I was saying this recently that I love it's really busy, but I kind of like that too. I thrive on it. But I think for me, the thing that's been different is this year. So I moved out of London earlier this year. So I'm now commuting to campus. And so I'm traveling like maybe 3 or 4 days a week on the train. And I think that's probably why it feels a lot more tiring than it usually does. But yeah, I love that buzz too. I completely can relate to what you're saying there. So Silke, for our guests who don't know you, tell us a bit about yourself.
So you said I'm Silke. I work in the psychology department at the University of Essex. My background is actually in English linguistics, American literature and media. And while I studied at university, I became particularly interested in the field of psycho and neurolinguistics. And then I started doing a master's in which I explored how bilinguals can function in both of their languages without much interference from one language to the other. And I did most of that work at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig in Germany. And in that institute, there was so much other cool stuff happening around language and the brain. And through that work, I got first introduced to basically work that looked at how we process emotions from voice. So I did my PhD there. And then during my training, I also spent some time at McGill in Montreal. And then early on in my career, I moved to Essex, where I first started as a lecturer, and I now work as a professor with a specialism in neurocognition of language. And my research focuses now on how social signals, so attitudes, emotions, motivations, anything that we want to convey through the way that we speak. So I kind of look at how do we convey this, and how do listeners pick up on the cues? And then lately, I've tried to find out how this plays out in teaching. So, for instance, we found that the way that a teacher talks can really affect students' well-being and their behavior. And I guess we're now kind of trying to find out how we can utilize that knowledge from how the brain processes these signals in real classrooms.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think you've done quite a lot in this area. It's actually interesting to reflect on how we met, because I was recently writing my own thesis, which was about verbal feedback. And as part of that, I was looking at the vocal kind of aspect of how verbal feedback is delivered and the impact on the student. So as part of my reading, I came across your paper, which was motivating tones to enhance education. And it was about the effects of vocal awareness on teachers' voices. So it was really interesting. I ended up reading the whole paper, and then got in touch with you. And now I guess here we are. So can you tell me a bit about that study, like how it came about and what you found?
Yeah, actually, it's a funny story because, yeah, you've heard from my CV, I'm not an educational psychologist. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, if anything. And I worked together with a social psychologist on how we could use language and voice cues to motivate other people. And this is a colleague of mine who's a really kind of strong researcher in the field of motivation. And we did some initial work. And as part of that initial work, we conducted a study that looked at how parents can communicate with their kids. And in particular, we looked at what happens if parents are rather controlling. So, using language that signals you have to do this, or else I'm going to take that toy away type of thing. So there's a sense of pressure. And we contrasted that with parenting practices, I guess, that were geared towards autonomy support. So really signaling to that child, you may choose this if you want to, but you really don't have to. So it's all around kind of giving these kids the choices. Anyway, long story short, we published some work that suggested it's not just it's not just what the parents said, but actually very much how they said something. We published that work, showed that children were more cooperative if they were provided with voice cues that signal choice. They reported feeling closer to their parents. They felt better. So lots of kind of positive benefits, and just using different ways of speaking. And that paper was read by people who work in teacher training. And they said, oh, this is something that really resonates with us, because the training that we provide to our teacher trainees actually looks very much at, how can voice cues be used in the classroom. So they very directly asked me, do you think that what you found in that study, would that translate into a classroom? And I said, I see no reason why it shouldn't, but in reality, that's an empirical question. And so that's how we actually carried out that work. It's because someone asked me a question, and I said, I have to check before I can give you a definite answer. And so then we ran studies with real teachers. We asked them to speak the same sentences in these different voice patterns, and then we played them to, I think it was 1,000 kids of different ages, 10 to 16. And we looked at the way that they respond to these voices. And basically, we found exactly what we had anticipated. They didn't like listening to harsh, pressuring voices. they preferred listening to soft, warm, autonomy supportive sounding voices. They reported feeling closer to the teachers. They shared or they had the intention of sharing more secrets with the teacher. So really bonded with those who used autonomy supportive sounding voices. And from then we kind of built a research program around this because we were fascinated with these results, just really trying to find out, like, what is it in the voice that makes someone feel in that way.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I mean, I have so many questions for you. What sort of age group was this conducted with?
So the original study with children was, I think, in between 6 and 10, if I remember correctly. To be honest, I can't remember exactly because we've since run so many studies from toddlers, infants actually, up to 18-year-olds. I can't remember what the original one was, but the one that you're referring to, so the ones in the school context, was children between, or youngsters between 10 and 16 years.
And so, I mean, even that in itself is interesting. If you've run it with a lot of different age groups, are you kind of generating similar findings across the different age groups?
Yes. So the most, I think, exciting finding for me was when we started testing this out on infants, obviously not in the teaching context, kind of very child-directed stimuli, where we had parents speak, I don't know, I can't remember, let's say something like, pick up that toy, or pick up that toy. So depending on how they spoke this, we realized quickly that infants were spending, they directed their attention actually to the controlling, harsh sounding voices, and were immediately startled. And that fit in line with some of the work that we'd done previously on brain responses, whereby we could show that within 200 milliseconds, listeners pick up on emotional voice cues. So whether you're angry or happy or sad, this is picked up by the listener well before the end of the utterance, or whatever you intended to say. So it's the kind of very immediate brain response, and that's often directed towards distinguishing at least harsh, angry, negative sounding voices from positive sounding voices. And then we followed this up in different studies. So the infants had this kind of clear mechanism directing my attention towards the speaker who sounds pressuring. And then with the kind of toddlers, we realized that we had some experiments by which they played that while they directed their attention towards pressuring voices, they also preferred listening to parents who spoke in soft, warm sounding voices. So, when we asked them things about, who they'd rather spend time with, for instance, the character who sounded very harsh, or the character who sounded very comforting and autonomy supportive, it's always that they picked the warmer sounding parent, and that kind of translates into these different age ranges, right? There's an attention grabbing mechanism that tells the brain there's something going on, but at the same time, the behavioral responses and the kind of I guess the way that children react to these speakers shows that they benefit from autonomy supportive and soft, happy sounding voices. So their physiological system is different. They don't show a stress response when they hear these voices. Lots of kind of cool stuff going on.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. I mean, I also wonder, I'm really, because I know that your studies have kind of gone up to age 18, but I wonder what sort of happens afterwards for university students, because I always wonder if it's sort of different for different students, because, you know, I have some students where, you know, they thrive on the pressure, and then there are others that, I guess, yeah, if you say things too softly, they won't take it seriously. Others, they need that in order to stay motivated and positive about the work that they're doing. But yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to get your view on that. But just in a second, I've also got to mention that this show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So if you want to level up your professional development today, you can visit hatchettelearning.com to explore their full range of titles. Also coming up is the BET show. So if you want to join BET for the biggest week in education, it's taking place from the 21st to the 23rd of January in the Excel in London. They've got immersive workshops, they've got thought-provoking speakers, hundreds of hours of CPD accredited content and cutting-edge technology. And of course, lots of networking. So there's no opportunity quite like it for educators. You can get your free ticket if you go on uk.betshow, which is BETT, show.com. So Silke, do you think that it's different for different students, or do you feel like in the majority case, these are, you know, the sort of, this is the way forward?
Well, actually, yeah, I guess you mentioned multiple things, and I want to be clear. I think all of our results, irrespective of age group, so that actually takes us into old age by now. So we've really covered the full range. Always shows that harsh pressuring sounding voices elicit negative well-being responses. And with negative well-being responses, I really mean things such as how close do I feel to this person? How does that person make me feel? How likely am I going to share secrets with that person? So irrespective of age group and other individual differences, we always find that harsh pressuring sounding voices elicit negative effects. But what you described was something like, well, you know, some students may thrive on the pressure to get things done. And that's slightly different in that we do have some research that shows if you want to get immediate short-term effects, pressure may actually work better if you as the motivator are very clear on, I want this done right now, and I want this done, you know, without any arguments. You make your position very clear. But to me, those are two different things, because it's about a short-term goal in which I may be more successful if I apply pressure. And I contrast that with a kind of long-term goal of sustaining a relationship with someone and trying to make sure that they feel valued, that they feel understood, that they understand that I show an interest in them. And those are the things that across the board we've always found, irrespective of age group, that the warmer and more autonomy supportive your voice sounds, the greater the benefits. Where we do find differences are around so-called neutral sounding voices. So for a very long time, I've always said to people, well, you know, you don't need to think too much about voice for as long as you stay clear of the pressure, unless you need it. Let's say you need to really give someone a last warning, or you want to make sure that they stay out of danger, right? So there is a place for sounding harsh, obviously, but in the classroom, under normal circumstances, you know, irrespective of whether you're teaching 18-year-olds, 25-year-olds, or 6-year-olds, I always said, for as long as you know, don't shout and aren't necessarily overly harsh, you're okay. But some of our recent findings have actually shown that staying neutral isn't necessarily a good thing for listeners who have either ADHD or autism. So lots of neurodiversity angles are currently being explored, and that's where we find that even those so-called neutral sounding voices can elicit negative consequences. But do you see the difference there? I'm not quite sure if I've explained that very well.
Yeah.
The point for me is you can totally motivate someone to do something, but that's very different to trying to make them feel good or feel bad, if you can see the kind of distinction I'm trying to draw.
I do. And I think that distinction is really helpful. And we do absolutely have to recognize the context. I also think that you can put pressure on a student and do it in a tone of voice that doesn't jolt them in a certain way, or in a tone of voice that's not harsh, I suppose. And so that's a separate thing, right? It's like, you know, pressure doesn't sound just one way. It can sound, you know, very different depending on how you actually put it across. So what are those like kind of technical elements when you did this research? Like, how were you analyzing voice cues? Were you looking at tone of voice? Were you looking at the speed or the volume at which people say things? Like, what are the kind of indicators that define what a good voice is, or what the appropriate voice is?
I was going to say I stay away from good and bad, because
Yeah.
I think that that there is a place for everything. Basically, we look at a range of different voice cues. So all of the ones that you've just described, we look at how high or low pitched someone sounds. We look at how fast or slow they speak. We look at how loud they are. But we also look at what people call voice quality cues. So that might be the energy and higher frequency bands, or it might be how nasal you sound, or it might be how rough or soft your voice comes across. And what we found is that most of our effects are driven, when we're looking at pressuring voices, are driven by so-called harsh sounding voices. So it doesn't matter too much whether you're high pitched or low pitched, although experience tells us, or some of the studies suggest, that the higher pitch you get, the more uncomfortable it can get for some listeners. But the really driving element is the energy and high frequency bands. It's the voice quality features that suggest that the voice just doesn't sound as rounded as it should. And those are the things that we're picking up. And those are unfortunately also the things that are quite difficult to train in isolation. But you can definitely train people to sound softer by giving them general voice training, which automatically reduces the harshness in your voice. And if you have a better breathing mechanism, for instance, then you're usually better to project. And if you tell people something very simple, such as, you know, you're trying to have the best interest of this person at heart, you know, you just give them a mindset, then our acoustic analyses show that these people already sound softer without any voice training whatsoever. They automatically reduce the harshness and the pressure in their voice.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder as well, like, you know, how often people think about or talk about voice. You know, like, I think in teaching particularly, how we speak might be one of the most powerful tools that we have in teaching. But it's usually sort of overlooked or perhaps not even considered. So why do you think that is, Silke? Like, what have you come across in your own experience around this? And, you know, is it just too personal when we talk about voice?
Oh, that's an interesting angle that I hadn't considered that one at all, about, you know, is it too personal? So my understanding is that in teacher training, and I haven't been through a teacher training program per se, so I can only report back what's been reported to me. My understanding is that there has actually been a kind of movement that suggested you want to convey authority. You want to make sure that students understand who's the boss in the classroom, kind of thing. So it might well be that, you know, by trying to tick off the boxes that are often associated with behavior management policies, we've involuntarily created harsher sounding classrooms than we anticipated. Why there is very little specialized voice training, or why it's not compulsory, for instance, is a little beyond me, because I actually think this would be the cheapest way to help with behavior management, to help with creating welcoming and supportive environments. So I can't answer your question as to why this hasn't happened, but I could say something around that I believe it should happen and would be fairly easy to establish, because I want to be clear, at least my research suggests that you don't need to train anyone to speak differently. So you're not trying to take their pitch away. You're not trying to you know, give them voice coaching to the extent that perhaps politicians are being told how to talk. It's literally about finding the sweet spot for you. What is your so-called centered neutral voice? You know, what is the best possible range with which you speak? So don't try to be overly high-pitched when you're talking to very young children. I think we can sometimes hear this in parents, nursery staff, you know, all sorts of people. When they're trying to talk to young children, they very often go up here, and that makes it uncomfortable for themselves, but also sometimes for others. So it isn't necessarily the case, in my view, that you would have to change anyone. I think it's more around understanding that if I consistently attack someone just with the way that I speak, then I shouldn't be surprised that they demonstrate behavior that isn't necessarily supportive of a classroom environment that I want to create.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess that the way we speak can sometimes build trust and create curiosity in our students, but it could probably just as easily shut the room down completely. So, you know, are there any things that we should kind of steer clear of or avoid to ensure that we don't completely disengage students when we teach them?
Yeah, okay. So again, we move into territory of me ending up to, you know, kind of telling people what to do, and it's the exact opposite. I think I want them to find out for themselves what works well and what doesn't work well. We have evidence that shows if you're not authentic, listeners can pick up on this easily and quickly. But my recommendation usually is, you know, just think about it, like literally think about the child, think about the student whom you're trying to support, and then think about kind of, I like this person, right? Like just be positive about them, smile a little bit, for instance, and that automatically leads you to employing warmer sounding voices. And our work shows that warmer voices enhance a sense of security in the listener. They help the other person to relax. They make them feel happier. They build trust. They also have the power to reduce anxiety, reduce pressure. They feel less angry. And they can enhance their feelings of competence, for instance. So what I want people to kind of take away often is just think about the person, think about the students who are in front of you, and, you know, just take a deep breath. When you're stressed, they pick up on the stress. Voices are contagious. And it isn't, as I said, it isn't about me telling anyone use a high pitch, use less fast pace, or these types of things. You know, speak in the way that's naturally to you, that feels natural to you, but with that added thought of, I want the other person to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are instances where perhaps that's easier said than done, or how do teachers respond, like when you, because I find this really fascinating, right, myself. I think sometimes there can be a resistance, right? Because most people are content with the way that they speak. And perhaps if we talk about making adjustments, I mean, I really like the way that you phrase things, because you said, I'm not trying to tell you to change your voice as such, you know, as a voice coach, but I'm just getting you to think about the person in front of you and make adjustments based on that, right?
Yes.
But I just wonder if, you know, because maybe our voice is sort of tied to who we are, perhaps there's like a resistance that we don't want to change who we are. And maybe, and I understand that's not what you're actually saying, but how do you reassure people of that? Like, do you find that there is a resistance towards some of the work that you're trying to do?
Well, that depends a little bit on who you talk to. I think if people misunderstand the intentions, then there is resistance immediately. I mean, that's exactly what our work would predict and shows. You know, if you're trying to tell someone what to do, there's defiance. And what you've described is a great example, right? If I told you this is the way that I want you to speak, then the natural reaction for you is to be, nope, not going to do this. And I think that's probably also one of the other reasons why I want to stay clear of that. The question you had about personality, for instance, you know, perhaps some people are just more strict. That's totally fine. And I always joke with my collaborator, who I believe is kind of probably the most autonomy supportive person you could think of, right? Very relaxed, very chilled, will always approach you with this open mindset. And then I contrast myself and I, you know, look at the way that I speak to my kids when I want to leave the house. There's very little autonomy support shining through, and lots of pressure of me saying, get your stuff, you know, get ready, etc. And funnily enough, I mean, by now my kids kind of make fun of this and say, can you hear yourself? You know, and I'm like, yes, I did just hear it. And I did hear that it felt uncomfortable in my throat, you know, when I was kind of reaching really deep. And so we have a bit of a kind of, we can joke around this, but what I really want to highlight is that, of course, everyone picks up when you're stressed, right? I mean, we actually have some work on that. It shows that you communicate differently when you're stressed. So I do, you know, your original question was a little bit around, like, you know, are there instances when this is more difficult? Absolutely. You know, the classroom is noisy in front of me. Or, you know, my kids aren't listening, whatever it is. I think there's a natural tendency that we think, if I just go very deep into my voice repertoire, and get out of it, you know, get all of it out, then they're going to follow. And this links back to what we said earlier. I'm not saying that they wouldn't listen. I'm not saying that they wouldn't at that point kind of react to your harsh, pressuring way of talking. But what I am saying is that it affects them on levels that perhaps go beyond your immediate, I want silence in the classroom. Because every teacher I know in the past has always said to me, I don't want them to be scared of me. You know, I don't want them to feel uncomfortable. I don't want them to not share with me. I just want them to do what I want them to do at that point of time. And I think it's about kind of finding that middle ground. So my recommendation is usually, and it's very simple, isn't it? It's just take a deep breath, right? Really make sure that before you respond to these immediate situations, if the situation allows, I mean, again, I always say if there is danger, you want to react as quickly as possible. But if it's about you trying to emphasize, hey, here I am, then it's absolutely fine to take a deep breath. You don't need to be overly friendly if you don't feel like it, because again, it wouldn't match, right? It's just about understanding what your intention is and giving you that extra little bit of help, breath support. Yeah, I don't know. Just really remember, I guess basically what I'm trying to tell people is that your voice carries your intention, and it shines through whether you're genuine, whether you show an interest. It shines through whether you're a little bit impatient. And we all know that, right? Like, I mean, it happens in our daily life multiple times a day. And it's not rocket science, I guess. And it's also at the same time a component that's easily overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think pausing and taking a deep breath, it is those simple things, right? It's not something revolutionary. It's just the simple things that we don't always remember to do when we're under stress or in a particular, interaction, which is challenging. I think like slowing things down certainly helps. It just allows everyone to kind of process the situation, right? If it's difficult or challenging. And I guess it gives everyone space as well to digest what's being said or what's being communicated. I also think slowing down, not just the speed at which we speak, but in life in general, it really helps to kind of build our capacity and our resilience when we're faced with these challenging situations. If we're rested and charged and, all of that, then we have time to sort of navigate whatever we're facing. But when we're not, then we can start talking fast and being edgy or agitated, and then things can just very quickly spiral from there. And then we go away from that intention that you were talking about. So yeah, I mean, it's super, super interesting. Silke, you were talking about people, the students picking up on the stress, right, when someone's speaking. And I think you said right at the start of the show that teachers' voices can really affect a student's well-being. What have you found in that regard in terms of where this may go a little deeper than just, someone saying something in the classroom to try and control the class, but then how does it go deeper?
So our original work looked at the way that people communicate with one another when we artificially induce stress. By now we also have work on kind of chronic stress, but I'll share some of, because I think they're fascinating, I'll share some of these original findings whereby we just really, gave people a difficult task to do, and they got stressed out because they couldn't succeed. And I think we basically asked them to do this for 5 minutes, and their arousal levels increased, and they were getting frustrated because, we gave them a task which was extremely difficult. And then later on, they were meant to kind of communicate in different emotions. And what we found is that the way that they, from an acoustic point of view, the way that they communicated these emotions differed to how people who were not stressed communicated these emotions. And the differences were picked up by listeners who, were just played those files. No one who listened knew this speaker was stressed or unstressed. We basically gave them an emotion recognition task. And what we found was that those who were stressed and communicating emotionally were misunderstood more frequently. And for me, the take-home message at that point, I remember this clearly, kind of when I saw the results, I was like, okay, this is something for me to remember, right? Every time I have an argument at home, because I've been stressed at work, I come home, I say something, and I get the sense that my boyfriend misunderstands what I'm kind of on about. Now I have evidence he does misunderstand it, but it's not him, it's actually me, right? It's me who's stressed, who's kind of using voice cues in a different way. So that is something that students can easily pick up on. So, we then also ask, who is stressed and how stressed are they, etc. And people can hear all of this. But what I found more fascinating wasn't just that I heard this person was stressed. I mean, to me, that was a kind of given. But what was interesting was that even when I was talking about something completely unrelated, that stress level still affected the way that I produced emotions, both positive and negative emotions. And the other person didn't get my signals because I communicated them differently to what they're used to and what they expected. So that's something to remember in the classroom, I think, because it goes both ways, right? If I, as the teacher, feel, oh my God, there's so much going on and that shines through, then yes, that can affect the students. But how many times do our students come in and they're already stressed? They're stressed because they have assignment deadlines. They're stressed because they had issues with their partners. They're stressed because, I don't know, all sorts of kind of different reasons. So when they communicate with me, they're also perhaps not performing at their, in quotation marks, best. And unless I have an awareness, and I guess that's what I'm trying to teach, if we have some voice awareness, then I can take that into account and I can adjust my behavior accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a lot of stress all around, isn't there? And I think the points that you made about some of the things that students are up against are definitely significant. I'm sure that there's lots of teachers listening in that are going, yeah, but we're stressed too. And look what we have to deal with. And,
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, emotions, as you say, can have a major influence on our ability to be able to speak in the way that we intend to, right? So what do you think teachers are up against here, and how can they, or we better control what we're feeling?
I don't know if I can comment on, how they can control what they're up against. But I do think I want to highlight a couple of related things, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Basically, lots of research, not just kind of voice research, lots of research has shown that if I provide help and support to someone else, this actually benefits myself. The work around whether or not you can, gain those benefits when you're speaking in soft, warm, autonomy supportive, whatever you want to kind of say, whatever you want to label this, interested sounding ways, right, is still in its infancy. So we don't really have a lot of data, but the original, the few data sets that we have definitely suggest that people who speak in these ways also feel better. And that makes sense, because if you think about it from a physiological point of view, right? Imagine you're stressed and I'm telling you, you know what, actually calm down, take a deep breath, regulate yourself, make sure that you have this other person's best interest at heart. It automatically regulates, right? You regulate your own emotions with the intention of actually, I'm trying to focus on my student, but you yourself have benefits. And there's anecdotal evidence that those teachers who are trained to speak in these kind of autonomy supportive ways actually have less sickness days. They stay longer in the profession. So the teacher training company that I worked with, they have some of their own stats that they've shared with policymakers, and basically their data suggests that there are immense benefits to people employing voice awareness in their daily teaching. So when you're saying, what are they up against? I think we just have to sometimes accept we are up against, things that are unbelievable difficult. But by focusing on the way that we speak, we automatically focus on the way that we feel. Anything that helps you with mindfulness, for instance, deep breathing techniques or anything like that, has an immediate benefit on the voice. And if you were to do those things in order to help yourself perform better in the classroom, then that's definitely something that benefits both teachers and students.
And I imagine it would benefit teachers everywhere, right? Like not just in the classroom, but, we've talked earlier about how this was very similar to results that you found about parents talking to children. So perhaps it's also going to help them when they go home and talk to their kids, right? And I think you gave an example earlier about, when you communicate with your partner. And I guess that these types of findings, they must be applicable in other contexts, personally as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So we have lots of work on that, actually. You can use voices to create, I guess, closer bonds with your partner. You can apply those findings in, I want to say, in every aspect of your life, right? Because we always have to communicate. So having voice awareness and how you come across, how I can change the way that I speak to come across less as X and more as Y, if that's your intention. I think that's something that, irrespective of whether you're talking to a child, whether you're talking in the healthcare context, for instance, imagine doctors having the time to listen to their patients and also to show a true interest in them and not feel rushed. We have actually some evidence that suggests that patients are more likely to share about their illnesses when they encounter these types of behaviors. So absolutely, I think it benefits you everywhere. And the really cool thing about this is I kind of feel that we sometimes forget this, is we do not necessarily need external training, right? We just need to be aware of, actually, this is what happens. So in theory, we could set aside a few minutes each day, focus on our breathing. We don't need to change anything drastically. We could just kind of make sure that when we talk, or even before we start talking in the morning, that we have some breathing exercises that help us. Or, we could warm up our voice in the shower. We could do all sorts of kind of small techniques that could, in theory, lead to immense benefits.
Absolutely. And Silke, I'm just curious to understand, did your study, you can't look at everything, but was there any kind of aspect where you looked at how maybe if English is not the first language of a teacher, or if there are cultural differences, can that impact the way that, voices are interpreted by
Yeah, so that's interesting because we just finished a study, which we haven't published yet, on cross-cultural communication. And the interesting bit is that in the past, all of my work and other people's work has always shown that when you communicate emotions, and I really kind of mean very standard, I'm happy, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm disgusted, you name it, kind of like very basic type of emotions. It's always been shown that even when you are very proficient in that other language, you don't recognize emotions as well as native speakers. Or put differently, there is a so-called in-group advantage in that when I communicate with speakers of my own language background, we're better at recognizing how the other person feels based on voice cues than recognizing emotions from out-group members. That's a well-established finding that goes for not just voices, actually also facial expressions, etc. So those types of things could work. But what we found in this work in the teaching domain was actually that it didn't matter where the teacher came from, whether they shared the same cultural background as the student or not. The take-home message was always that soft and warm-sounding voices or autonomy supportive-sounding voices lead to reduced feelings of pressure and anger, and enhanced feelings of autonomy, competence, relatedness, all the kind of well-being effects that I've previously talked about, irrespective of whether or not the teacher and the student came from the same group. And this was slightly different to what I expected. So we ran a second study with different cultural backgrounds just to check.
Yeah.
But yeah, nope, that effect is quite stable, which I think tells us a little bit about how, and it mirrors effects actually that we have when we look at interested sounding voices, or those showing encouraging cues as opposed to disinterested voices or critical voices, where again cultural differences do not really play a major role. When you look, and I want to be clear, when you look at these well-being effects, that doesn't mean that when you ask people to name what is that person feeling, perhaps you have different labels, but the effects of that voice, and that's what is of interest to me, the effects of that voice that you're utilizing transcend boundaries.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I think it's good to know that it did go beyond those boundaries, and that didn't sort of like impact your results as such. It kind of simplifies, what we need to do moving forward as well, right? And I think that's super interesting. Silke, do you think that there's like a difference between how we think that we sound and how we're heard? Because, I'm really interested in what you said around intention. And I just wonder, sometimes in a conflict or a misunderstanding, there's an adamance, isn't there, from the person to say, but I wasn't saying it like that. And the other person sort of saying, yeah, but I heard it like that. Did you, or have you ever done anything where you've kind of fed back to the person with the harsh sounding voice, or a voice that sounds a particular way, that they, that's how their voice is being heard or interpreted, and how they kind of, responded to that?
Yes and no. So we haven't published anything on that, but we have piloted some of these findings. It depends a little bit on how you elicit those materials. So I think the situations that you're describing are very kind of context dependent, and not necessarily easy to simulate in our lab environments. And most people don't necessarily want us to record them 24 hours on a daily basis to find out instances of like, is that what you really meant, or is that what you conveyed? But yeah, no, absolutely, there can be discrepancies, and I think that in itself isn't necessarily the problem. I think problems arise when there's a constant mismatch, right? Of someone thinking, oh, but I didn't mean to be rude, or didn't mean to be coming across unfriendly, or those types of things. And I think in those instances, we have to look carefully, okay, which cues are they using that throw other people? And part of the work that I'm kind of thinking about right now is work that I did with brain lesion patients. So patients who, for instance, suffered a stroke and had a lesion afterwards, where the spouses consistently told me, it's like, they just don't sound the same, and they're constantly being angry, and the other person was producing speech and didn't have the intention to sound angry. In fact, sometimes we told them, can you try to sound happy? And when we look at their brain response, not on their brain, when we look at their acoustic responses, we find that that they actually produce speech differently. Now, here, obviously, we have a very clear signal, as in, there's a part of the brain that's responsible for emotion expression is missing. Hence, other parts of the brain had to pick up on this, and that made it a bit more difficult for them to do. But I think for me, the question then is like, okay, so, is it possible that signals are transmitted in ways that wasn't the intention of the speaker? And absolutely, yes, that happens. I think we just need to look at, if that happens frequently, what went wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many areas that we've covered. Time has just kind of flown by, but it's been so fascinating to hear about all the different aspects of your research and your findings. And I think these are really important to talk about in this context of teaching, because there are a lot of areas where we can perhaps make our lives easier if we just make sort of small, simple adjustments to the way that we use our voice, I suppose. Now, I always ask my guests to produce a 3-minute masterclass. So before we end, I'd love for you to tell us what you have. And prior to that, I just want to remind everyone that this show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, who are publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. You can level up your professional development today if you visit hachetlearning.com to explore their full range of titles. So, Silke, tell us, what's your masterclass about?
Okay, so this class builds on the findings from neuroscience, which, as I've said, suggests that before students understand your words, they actually feel your voice. In other words, they pick up on how you feel and what intentions you bring to the classroom. And as I said earlier, my own work shows that when teachers use an autonomy supportive voice, so a voice that sounds warm, open, choice-giving, then students report feeling closer to teachers. They're more likely to help their peers, they engage in creative learning strategies, and they generally feel happier. And in contrast, if the same sentence was delivered in a controlling tone, sounds pressuring or harsh, then that triggers negative feelings, defiance, resistance, and tendencies to cram in information rather than engage in learning freely. So my first lesson is your tone of voice can either open or close students' minds. And the first rule is thus rather simple. Remember that your voice carries your intention. So you want to make sure that you sound supportive rather than superior, because when you do, your students feel trusted rather than managed, I guess. Now, recent work by my PhD student also shows that when speakers sound interested, so they demonstrate that they really care about the other person and that they want to know what the other person has to say, then listeners feel genuinely heard and they become more willing to disclose and engage. And I think that's really gold for our classrooms, because curiosity and interest are contagious. They spread through the way that we talk. So we could adjust our pace, for instance, if we want to slow down a little bit when we communicate key ideas. We can pause, that we show that we value the student's opinion and their thinking. When we use pitch, we may want to vary it. When you rise your pitch, you invite an answer, and having a kind of moving pitch pattern really shows that you're open to hearing what the other person has to say. And you may want to lower your volume at times to really make sure that students understand that you're on their side. So basically, every single acoustic cue should tell your students, "I'm with you," not, "I'm trying to manage you" or "I'm over you." I think the simplest technique of all is that I've learned a long time ago that when you smile while you speak, even though students may not necessarily see this, the smile softens the way that we talk, and it signals approachability. And the final takeaway for me is that if you want your students to listen, then make sure that you sound supportive, interested, because the science shows that your voice is how you connect with students.
Well, that was brilliant, Silke. I love those tips. I think they're very, very useful for our listeners. I smiled when I heard you talking about smiling. I remember when I worked as a voiceover for many years, my producer used to say to me, I was doing it for radio, but my producer always used to say to me, have this huge smile on your face, like really big. Come on, Seema, like you might feel like a bit of a clown, but it's going to bring so much warmth into your voice. And it really works. So yeah, when you said that, it reminded me of that moment, which I always keep with me, because I think it's true, and I think it also links back to something that you said before, right? That when we do that, and we make others feel good, then, we might be stressed, we might be up against it all, but it can make us feel better too. So yeah, these have been some really great insights. Thank you so much for joining me, Silke. And yeah, it's been a great conversation. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on and giving me an opportunity to kind of outline some of the research findings. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone. And we will speak to you again next month.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.